The air in the sub-basement of the Vatican was stale with the breath of dead centuries. It did not smell of piety, but of dry paper, decaying leather, and the profound silence of forgotten histories. This was the secret archive of the Sanctus Vindex, the Holy Avengers, and Bishop Athanasius was its most diligent student. He was not praying. He was studying a failure. Before him, illuminated by the cold, steady light of a single oil lamp, lay a field report bound in scarred hide. The ink was faded, the cursive hurried and panicked. It detailed the mission to a small village in the Pyrenees foothills 2 years prior, a village he had reached 3 days too late. He traced a finger over a passage describing what the Vindex agents found. Scorched earth, splintered timbers, and the unsettlingly tidy remains of its 63 inhabitants. The cult had been thorough. They had not just killed, they had harvested. Athanasius closed the book, the soft thud echoing in the vault. That failure was a brand on his soul, a cold stone in his gut. He would never be late again. A soft knock drew his attention. A young acolyte stood in the stone archway holding a sealed dispatch. "From the Alpine Diocese, Your Excellency," the boy whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and reverence. Athanasius took the letter. The wax seal was that of Bishop Theron, a man known for his bureaucratic rigidity, not his panicked correspondence. Athanasius broke it with his thumb. The letter inside was anything but rigid. Theron wrote of madness at the remote abbey of St. Gaul, high in the snow-dusted peaks. He spoke of a blasphemous discovery made during foundation repairs, followed by the deaths of 2 monks. The local authorities and Theron himself had publicly attributed the deaths to a wolf attack, a desperate attempt to quell panic. But the letter screamed a different truth. As Athanasius scanned the frantic lines, his eyes caught something on the parchment itself. Held against the lamp, a faint watermark became visible. It was a symbol he had never seen in any scripture or heretical text. A pale, jagged spiral, like a galaxy drawn by a madman or the coil of a worm's gut. It seemed to pulse in the low light, and a chill, entirely separate from the crypt's cold, traced a path down his spine. An hour later, in his private cell, Athanasius prepared for war. His arsenal was not one of swords and shields, but of faith forged into practical weapons. He opened a long, velvet-lined case to reveal the Silentium Argenteum, the silver silence. It was not a holy relic, but a masterfully crafted break-action crossbow with a stock of polished ironwood and a limb of layered steel and ash. He checked the firing mechanism, the familiar, satisfying click echoing in the stone room. The bolts were silver-tipped, each etched with a microscripture from the Book of Job. Next, he turned to a heavy bronze censer, the censer of retribution. He didn't fill it with simple frankincense. Into a leather pouch, he measured out a mixture of powdered silver, rock salt, and dried wolfsbane. When lit, its smoke was not merely fragrant. It was a choking, searing deterrent to things that shunned the light. From a lead-lined vial, he carefully decanted a viscous golden oil into a smaller, more durable flask. The tears of the martyr, rendered from the rendered fat of saints, mixed with blessed olive oil, glowed with a soft, internal luminescence in the gloom. It did not burn evil, but revealed it, clinging to tainted flesh like phosphorus. Finally, he picked up the speculum anime, the soul mirror. It was a simple disc of polished obsidian set in a silver frame. Not a tool for scrying, but for diagnosis. He held it up, and for a fleeting second his own reflection stared back, not as a bishop of the Vindex, but as a weary, middle-aged man. and behind him, a flicker of shadow, the ghost of an old sin from his life before the cloth, the sin that drove him into this service as penance. He put the mirror away. The past was a ghost, but the present was a monster. The journey into the Alps was a grinding trial. A heavy, wet snow fell relentlessly, turning the winding mountain passes into treacherous curtains of white. The carriage wheels churned through slush and ice, the horses steaming and straining with every step. Wolves, bolder and hungrier in the harsh weather, shadowed their path, their howls a mournful chorus in the oppressive silence of the peaks. The local peasants were even less welcoming. In the last village before the final ascent, their faces were shuttered, their whispers like the skittering of rats. The abbey was cursed, they said. Unholy screams carried on the wind at night, and something had been seen moving in the forests, something too big and too fast to be a bear. Athanasius hired a local guide, an old hunter named Günther. He was a man carved from the mountain itself, with a face like a wind-battered cliff and eyes that held a permanent sorrow. A year ago, Günther's only son had vanished on these same slopes while hunting. The official cause was an avalanche, but Günther spat at the mention of it. "The mountain doesn't take you like that," he'd rasped, his voice rough as granite. "Something else does. Something that lives in the high woods." He agreed to guide Athanasius, not for the coin, but for a chance, however slim, to face the thing that had stolen his boy. They were less than a mile from the abbey when Günther reined in his horse, his hand raised. Ahead, in a small clearing, was a fresh kill. A massive bull elk lay in the snow, its antlers tangled in the low branches of a fir tree. But this was no wolf's work. Its rib cage had been shattered, the bones bent outward, as if something had exploded from within its chest. The internal organs were gone, not ripped and torn, but excised with an unnatural surgical precision. All around the carcass, the pristine snow was melted and blackened in grotesque patterns, sizzling faintly as if splashed with acid. Günther made the sign of the cross, his weathered face pale. "No wolf," he breathed. "No bear." Athanasius dismounted, his boots crunching in the sullied snow. He knelt, ignoring the coppery scent of blood and the acrid tang of whatever had melted the snow. He examined the tracks. They were deep, three-toed and clawed, but the gait was wrong for any canine or ursine. The stride was too long, the pressure too focused. It was the track of something that walked like a man but was built like a beast. He stood, his expression grim. "No," he said, his voice flat. "Nothing I know." The Abbey of St. Gaul appeared through the swirling snow not as a sanctuary, but as a prison hunkered against the mountainside. Its high stone walls were grim and featureless, its iron-banded gates shut tight. A thick, unnatural silence hung over it. When Athanasius pulled the heavy iron ring for the bell, the sound was swallowed by the snow-laden air. It took a full 5 minutes before a small Judas window slid open, revealing a pair of terrified eyes. "Go away! The abbot has forbidden entry!" The voice from within trembled. "I am Bishop Athanasius of the Sanctus Vindex, sent from Rome," Athanasius announced, his voice cutting through the wind. "Open this gate by order of the Holy See." There was a long pause, then the sound of heavy bolts being drawn. The gate creaked open just wide enough for them to enter. The monk, who introduced himself as Brother Peter, was a pale, shaking man. His face was slick with sweat despite the freezing cold. "Forgive me, Excellency," he stammered, not meeting Athanasius's gaze. Abbot Alcuin gave strict orders. No one was to enter or leave until the moon wanes. The courtyard was deserted. A profound chill emanated from the stone itself, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The air was thick with the cloying smells of sickness, fear, and a desperate overuse of incense. In the abbot's study, Athanasius finally met Father Alcuin. He was a man crumbling under an invisible weight, a withered husk of a scholar whose fingers were stained black with ink and dark brown with dried blood. He attempted a facade of control, insisting the abbey was merely suffering a spiritual malady, a test of faith. But his eyes, darting and wide with terror, betrayed the lie. As Alcuin spoke, Athanasius's gaze drifted past him into the long, shadowed scriptorium visible through the open door. He saw a young monk, his back to them, surreptitiously tracing a symbol into the stone floor with his own fingernail. It was the same jagged spiral from the letter's watermark. Later, as he was shown to his quarters, he saw it again, scratched into the plaster of a hallway, daubed in what looked like soot near a doorway. When he stopped one of the brothers and asked gently what the symbol meant, the monk's eyes glazed over. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of soured wine and fear, and hissed, "It is his song. He hears it." The scriptorium was a crime scene consecrated with the scent of old parchment and fresh blood. It was here, Abbot Alcuin explained with a tremor in his voice, that the trouble began. And it was here that Brother Thomas, the abbey's chief librarian and a man who had not left its walls in 40 years, had met his end. The body had been removed, the worst of the gore scrubbed from the flagstones, but the room still held the ghost of violence. A dark, rust-colored stain bloomed across the floor near a massive oak lectern, and the air itself felt bruised. Athanasius was no longer a bishop. He was an investigator. He ignored Alcuin's platitudes and knelt, running a gloved hand over the stone. "The monks who found him," he said, his voice low and commanding. "What did they say?" "That a wolf had gotten in," Alcuin whispered. "A freak of nature. Impossible." "Indeed." Athanasius pointed to a series of deep gouges in the stone. "Too deep for a wolf. The pressure required to score granite like this, it's immense, and the pattern is wrong." He followed the scratches to the far wall, where they terminated near the ceiling. His eyes scanned the stones until he found it. A tiny black shard, no bigger than his thumbnail, wedged in the mortar 7 feet from the floor. He carefully pried it out with the tip of a knife. It was obsidian-like, cold to the touch, and flaked at the edges like fine slate, identical to the material of the artifact. The artifact itself lay on a central table, shrouded in a coarse burlap cloth as if it were a corpse. A ring of tallow candles burned around it, their flames guttering and twitching unnaturally, as though in a constant draft. "He found it in a cavity behind the foundation stones," Alcuin said, gesturing to a section of the wall where new masonry stood out against the old. He was obsessed. He called it the Stone Gospel. With a shaking hand, Alcuin drew back the cloth. The object beneath was not a book. It was a collection of 12 thin, rectangular plates of the same black volcanic stone, each about the size of a legal tablet. They were bound together by what looked like twisted, petrified sinew. The surface of each plate was covered in symbols, but they were not letters of any known language, ancient or modern. They were complex, interlocking spirals, geometric patterns, and jagged lines that seemed to writhe and shift in the candlelight. The moment they were exposed, the air grew heavy, pressing in on Athanasius. A low thrumming sensation vibrated up through the soles of his boots, and a dull ache began to pound behind his eyes. The symbols didn't reflect the light. They seemed to drink it, creating small pools of shadow on their own surfaces. This was not a text to be read. It was an antenna, designed to receive a signal from somewhere terribly far away. Athanasius forced himself to focus, pushing past the wave of nausea. Who else has been in close contact with this thing? Alcuin wrung his hands. Brother Morcant, our blacksmith. He led the work on the foundation and was the first to see the hollow space. And Brother Elia, a young novice, pious. He was the first to touch the plates after Thomas brought them out. He believed they were a gift from God. Athanasius met them both later that day. Brother Morcant was a giant of a man, with shoulders as broad as a barrel and hands that could bend iron bars. He moved with a sullen, coiled energy, his face a mask of stoicism that failed to hide the fear in his eyes. He said little, answering Athanasius's questions with monosyllabic grunts. A fresh, ugly-looking scar, puckered and red, marred the back of his right hand. When Athanasius asked about it, Morcant simply said, "A slip of the tongs in the forge. It looked far more like a bite." Brother Elia was his opposite. He was small and frail, a boy of no more than 19, with the ethereal look of a Renaissance cherub now twisted by terror. He was confined to his cell. When Athanasius entered, he found the boy huddled in a corner, scratching at the stone walls with his nails. He suffered from violent seizures, Alcuin had warned, and during them, he spoke in a torrent of guttural clicks and hisses, a language no one could identify. The boy looked up at Athanasius, his eyes vast pools of lucid dread. "It sings," he whimpered. "In my skull. It wants me to let it in." That evening, Athanasius conducted his first formal interrogation of Abbot Alcuin in the cold confines of the study. The pretense was gone. Alcuin sat slumped in his chair, a broken man. "I thought it was a revelation," he confessed, his voice cracking. "The language of the seraphim, perhaps. A pre-Babel text. I was a fool. A proud, damnable fool." He admitted that he had spent hours with the plates trying to decipher them to find a key. The madness had begun subtly. First, it was just Brother Thomas who began talking to himself and neglecting his duties. Then Elia had his first fit. Then the nightmares started, shared by all who had spent time in the scriptorium. When they found Thomas's body ripped apart with such savage force, Alcuin had panicked. He'd feared the Inquisition, feared his abbey would be deconsecrated, its legacy erased. He had covered it up, ordering the monks to speak of wolves, and locked the abbey down, praying the affliction would simply burn itself out. As Alcuin spoke of his intellectual pride, Athanasius discreetly drew the soul mirror from his coat. He held the obsidian disc in his lap, angled to catch the abbot's reflection. The polished surface showed the study, the flickering candlelight, the worn tapestry on the wall. But the image of Alcuin was horribly distorted. His eyes in the reflection were not his own. They were dark, empty pits, like burnt-out wells. And shimmering behind his slumped shoulders, an ethereal shadow shifted and pulsed, a vague insectoid shape of torn, membranous wings and too many joints. It was not a sign of possession in the classic sense. A demon would have recoiled from the mirror's presence. This was something different. A deep, spiritual corruption, a rot that had taken root in the man's soul. Athanasius put the mirror away, a cold knot of certainty tightening in his stomach. "I require access to your library," he stated. "The restricted section." The forbidden archives of St. Gaul were a testament to centuries of collected knowledge, much of it deemed too dangerous for the common man. Here, amid books bound in human skin and scrolls detailing pagan rites, Athanasius found what he was looking for. It was a thick, leather-bound chronicle, its pages written in the cramped Latin of a 9th century monk. Tucked away in a passage describing the abbey's founding, he found a chilling entry. The abbey's founder, St. Gallus himself, had discovered a chamber deep beneath the mountain. In it, he found a set of singing stones. The entry described how the stones induced melancholy, then madness in any who listened, for they sang the song of the empty sky and called down the hunger from the moon. Gallus, deeming them too dangerous to destroy, had them sealed away in the very foundation of the scriptorium, encased in lead and consecrated with the bones of a saint, hoping they would never be found again. The curse was not new. It had been sleeping beneath their feet for over 800 years. That night, sleep offered Athanasius no respite. He was cast adrift in a nightmare of impossible scale. He floated in a black, silent void, the cold so absolute it felt like fire. Stars burned like diamond dust in the infinite distance. Before him hung the moon, but it was wrong. It was cracked and fractured like a colossal eggshell, and a sickly pale light bled from the fissures. From the largest crack, a single immense eye stared out at him, an eye the size of a continent, its pupil a swirling vortex of black. It did not see him with malice, but with a simple, profound, and eternal hunger. He awoke with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs. His own choked cry was immediately drowned out by a far more piercing scream from down the hall. It was the shriek of a soul in agony. It was Brother Elia. The morning brought a second corpse. Brother Peter, the terrified gatekeeper, was found in the wine cellar. Gunther, whose tracking skills Athanasius trusted more than the word of any panicked monk, discovered the body when he went looking for a cask of ale. The scene was one of quiet, brutal devastation. Peter was not torn or savaged. He was crushed. His body was horrifically compressed, as if a great weight had been lowered onto him, shattering his skeleton and rupturing him from the inside out. Heavy oak barrels, each weighing several hundred pounds, were splintered and tossed about the cellar like toys. The stone floor was slick, not with wine, but with the same black viscous saliva that had pooled around the elk. It hissed faintly where it touched the air, releasing a thin, acrid vapor. Athanasius surveyed the scene with the cold precision of a surgeon. This was not the work of a mindless beast. This was the work of a cunning predator. He noted the heavy oak door to the cellar. It was barred from the inside. "Who found him?" he asked Gunther. The old hunter pointed to the splintered remains of the door. "I did. Had to break it down. Barred from the inside, like you see." Athanasius's eyes scanned the room. One door, solid stone walls, and there, high on the wall just below the vaulted ceiling, was a narrow ventilation slit, no more than 8 inches wide, meant to let fumes escape. Far too small for any man or even a wolf to pass through. The creature had to be either strong enough to burst through solid stone without leaving a mark, or it had to be able to change its shape, to pour itself through the narrow opening like liquid. He knew which was more likely, and the thought made his blood run cold. The interrogations that followed were a study in futility. Everyone had an alibi, each one plausible yet steeped in the abbey's pervasive atmosphere of deceit. Abbot Alcuin claimed to have been in the chapel, deep in a night-long prayer vigil. Brother Morcant, the blacksmith, insisted he had been in his forge until dawn, tempering a new set of tools. He even had witnesses, 2 nervous-looking monks who swore they saw the glow of his fire and heard the ring of his hammer throughout the night. Brother Elia, the most obvious suspect in his madness, had been locked in his cell, the door bolted from the outside since his screaming fit the night before. Everyone was accounted for, yet Brother Peter was dead. Someone was lying, or worse, someone was covering for the killer. Athanasius went to the forge. The heat from the massive stone hearth was a welcome respite from the abbey's oppressive chill. Morcant was there, his massive form silhouetted against the roaring flames. He was not making tools. With powerful rhythmic blows, he was shaping a piece of red-hot steel on the anvil. The object was curved, sharp, and wickedly pointed. It looked like a massive 5-inch-long talon. Several more, newly forged and cooling in a trough of water, lay on a nearby bench. "Preparing for a hunt, Brother Morcant?" Athanasius asked, his voice even. Morcant didn't stop hammering. "The abbot's prayers aren't working," he growled, sweat glistening on his brow. "Whatever this thing is, it understands steel better than it understands Latin. And the bite on your hand?" The hammer fell with a deafening clang. Morcant finally turned, his eyes burning with a desperate fire. "I told you. The forge." His gaze flickered for a fraction of a second, a silent admission of the lie. He was not afraid of the beast, Athanasius realized. He was afraid of himself. Next, he visited Elia. The young novice was calmer now, but the calm was somehow more disturbing than his earlier frenzy. The walls of his cell were now covered in the jagged spiral, drawn over and over again until his fingernails were raw and bloody. He sat on his cot, rocking back and forth. The voice. "It promised me peace," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle. "It says the hunger is a gift, a cleansing. It wants me to open the door for it so everyone can feel the quiet." He looked at Athanasius, his eyes pleading. "Please, kill me before I say yes." That night, Athanasius decided to hunt. He dismissed Gunther's offer to help, telling him to watch the main gate. This was a task for his own tools. He chose the long, vaulted corridor that connected the cloisters to the dormitories, a natural choke point. He extinguished all the torches, plunging the hallway into absolute darkness. He stood in the shadows, the silver silence loaded and ready, his senses honed by years of this work. For hours, there was nothing but the moan of the wind outside the thick walls. Then, he heard it. A faint, wet scraping sound from the far end of the hall. It was the sound of something heavy and soft dragging itself over the stone. He raised the crossbow, his eye aligning with the sights he could barely see. The sound grew closer, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic clicking like the chattering of 1,000 insect mandibles. He held his breath, waiting for a silhouette, a shape, anything. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows. It was huge, far larger than a man, and its form was horribly fluid, shifting and indistinct. Athanasius fired. The silver-tipped bolt hissed through the air. There was a sickening wet impact, followed by a piercing shriek of pain and rage, a sound that was neither animal nor human, but a blasphemous fusion of both. The shadow recoiled with impossible speed, vanishing back into the darkness from which it came. Athanasius waited, his heart pounding, before cautiously advancing with a lit taper. On the floor, he found his bolt. It was not clean. It was coated in the same black, viscous fluid from the cellar, which was already eating away at the silver tip, corroding it into a dull gray slag. And caught on the fletching was a small tuft of coarse iron-gray fur. the same color as the hair on the back of Brother Morcant's powerful hands. It seemed a damning piece of evidence, but as he stood there, the low humming vibration from the scriptorium seemed to travel through the stone floor, a silent mockery. He returned to the terrible stone manuscript, the taper in his hand casting dancing shadows over its cryptic surface. And then, a thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had been a fool. Alcuin, in his pride, had tried to read it. Athanasius, in his investigation, had tried to understand it. They were both wrong. He looked closer, not at the individual symbols, but at their arrangement, their flow. The spirals were not letters. The geometric patterns were not words. They were musical notations. They were vibrational diagrams. This wasn't a gospel. It wasn't a story. It was a psalm. A song that, when heard, didn't just corrupt the soul. It rewrote the flesh. It was a tuning fork that forced the human body into a new horrific resonance, making it a receptive vessel for the hunger it summoned. And someone in this abbey had learned how to sing. The madness was no longer contained. It seeped through the abbey's stone walls like a feverish sweat. The shared nightmare of the cold cosmos and the cracked moon now plagued nearly every monk. They would wake up screaming in the pre-dawn chill, their sheets soaked with sweat. In the refectory, they moved like automatons, their eyes vacant. Men would stop mid-sentence, cocking their heads as if listening to a distant sound only they could hear. They began to hum. It was a tuneless, dissonant drone, yet it held a distinct, terrifying rhythm, the rhythm of the symbols on the stone plates. The curse was airborne, a psychic contagion spreading from mind to mind. Athanasius knew he was dealing with an enemy whose nature was fundamentally alien. To understand it, he conducted a risky experiment. In the privacy of his cell, he took the small black stone chip he'd recovered from the scriptorium wall. He filled a silver basin with holy water, its surface clear and still. Chanting a prayer of binding, he used a pair of iron tongs to place the stone chip next to the basin. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the water closest to the chip began to darken, turning a murky gray. A thin wisp of vapor rose from its surface with a faint, continuous hiss, not the violent boil of demonic corruption, but a slow, cold evaporation, as if the stone were an anchor to a reality where the laws of physics were simply wrong. This was not an evil born of hell. It was something from outside, something that viewed their very existence as a flawed and temporary state. His suspicions solidifying, Athanasius searched Abbot Alcuin's private quarters. It was a simple, ascetic cell, but years of hunting heretics had taught him that the most devout-looking places often held the darkest secrets. Behind a false panel at the back of a wardrobe, he found it, a small, leather-bound journal. It was Alcuin's personal log. The early entries were filled with scholarly excitement. Alcuin described his discovery of the manuscript with breathless reverence, convinced he had found a key to unlocking divine mysteries. Then, his tone shifted. He wrote of his attempts to vocalize the symbols, to sing the stone psalm. He believed it would bring him closer to God. The last few pages were a descent into utter lunacy. The neat, scholarly script devolved into a frantic scrawl, the pages filled with the same jagged spiral. Words and phrases repeated over and over. The sweet hunger, a blessing of glorious emptiness. The moon's yoke will feed us all. Alcuin had not been a victim. He had been an active, willing participant. Athanasius confronted Morcant in the clanging din of the forge. He didn't ask questions this time. He made statements. He laid out details from a file the Sanctus Vindex kept on individuals of interest. Before you were Brother Morcant, you were known as the Hammer, a mercenary in the Florentine Wars, famous for a battle rage that made you indistinguishable from a beast. You killed 17 men with your bare hands outside Genoa. The blacksmith froze, the hammer in his hand lowering slowly, the swagger and anger drained out of him, replaced by a deep, hollow shame. "I came here to bury that man," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "To chain the beast inside me. For 20 years, I have known peace." He looked at his own scarred hands, trembling slightly. "When I touched those stones, I felt the old rage stir. I felt it waking up. This thing in the Abbey. It calls to the beast inside me. I am terrified that one night I will answer." The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but it was one he did not like. He needed to be certain. That evening, he gathered the remaining monks in the chilly refectory. He announced he would perform a rite of purification. On a small table, he placed a wide, shallow bowl filled with the glowing golden oil, the tears of the martyr. "Each of you will come forward and wash your hands in this holy oil," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "It will burn any flesh that harbors a taint of the unholy." It was a bluff. The oil revealed it did not burn, but fear was a powerful regent. One by one, the monks came forward, their faces pale. They dipped their hands in the oil, and nothing happened. Then came Morcant. He hesitated, his jaw tight, clearly expecting to be consumed by fire. He plunged his hands into the bowl. The oil remained placid and glowing. Relief washed over his face. Then it was Eliah's turn. The young novice shuffled forward, guided by another monk. As his trembling fingers touched the surface of the oil, it did not flare, but its soft, internal light intensified, shifting from gold to a cold, pale white, the color of moonlight on snow. It clung to his skin, illuminating it from within. Athanasius stared, his mind reeling. The reaction was undeniable, but it was not the violent conflagration of possession. It was a resonance. He was interrupted by a frantic pounding on the refectory door. It was Günther, his face ashen. He had remained near the outer gate, a self-appointed sentinel. "Bishop," he panted, "the woods. They've gone silent for the past hour. No wolves, no owls, nothing. All the animals have fled the mountain." He swallowed hard. "And a few minutes ago, I heard something on the roof, something heavy. It was crawling on the slates." Athanasius dismissed the monks, his mind racing, weaving the disparate threads into a single terrifying tapestry. The cunning of the killer, its ability to pass through a narrow slit in the wall, the strange, resonant reaction of the oil to Elia, the novice's own words about a voice in his head, Morcant's genuine internal struggle. It all led to a horrifying conclusion. He had been looking for a single killer, a single host. He was wrong. The psalm had not just created a monster, it had created a resonance field, a psychic plague. There was one primary host, one true vessel for the entity. But its power, its rage, and its consciousness could bleed into others, especially the psychically vulnerable like Elia or the spiritually conflicted like Morcant. It could use them as decoys, as puppets to create false trails and sow confusion. He wasn't hunting a wolf in the fold. He was trapped in the fold with a ghost that could wear any of them as a mask. The day before the full moon, an unnatural quiet descended upon the Abbey of St. Gaul. It was not the peaceful silence of contemplation, but the dead, breathless hush of a world holding its breath. The perpetual wind that scoured the mountainside died away. The snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, muffling all sound. The monks, those who could still walk, retreated to their cells, barring their doors. They were not praying. They were hiding. Athanasius felt the change in the very air. It was a pressure building, a coiling of immense, unseen energy. The creature was not sleeping. It was gathering its strength for the coming night. There would be no more hunting in the shadows. The monster was too clever, its nature too fluid. The only way to win was to force a confrontation, to trap them all in one place and compel the entity to reveal its true form. He chose the abbey's main chapel. It was the oldest part of the monastery, a fortress within a fortress, with 3-foot-thick stone walls and a single massive door of iron-banded oak. He gathered the handful of monks who still possessed a shred of sanity. "Tonight," he announced, his voice echoing in the empty hall, "we end this. We will hold an all-night vigil in the chapel. We will pray for deliverance and perform a rite of exorcism over the entire abbey." It was a lie, but a necessary one. The chapel would not be a place of prayer. It would be a killing floor. The rest of the day was a blur of frantic preparation. Athanasius worked alongside Günther and the few terrified but resolute monks. They turned the house of God into a carefully constructed trap. Candles were brought in by the crate, but before they were set, Athanasius had the monks melt the tallow and mix it with the contents of the pouch he carried, rock salt and finely chopped wolfsbane. The smoke would be an irritant, a constant source of pain for the creature. He tasked Morcant with reinforcing the chapel door. The blacksmith, seeming grateful for a physical task to distract him from his inner turmoil, worked with a feverish intensity, adding 2 more heavy iron crossbars and hammering thick steel wedges into the frame. Athanasius worked alone at the altar. He took out his flask of martyr's tears, and instead of using it for diagnosis, he poured the glowing oil into a dozen small clay vials. He secretly positioned them along the base of the altar rail, creating a hidden, spiritual line of defense, a fire break for a fire that burned souls instead of flesh. His preparations were interrupted by Abbot Alcuin. The old man, his eyes alight with a terrifying, ecstatic fire, stumbled into the chapel. He was no longer a frightened scholar. He was a prophet on the verge of his apocalypse. "What are you doing?" he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy. "You cannot stop it. This is no exorcism. This is a birth, a holy communion with a new true God. You are a heretic trying to deny us salvation." Athanasius saw the totality of the man's madness. There was no reaching him. With a heavy heart, he gestured to Morcant. The blacksmith, his face a grim mask, took the abbot by the arms. Alcuin struggled, spitting curses and blasphemies, but he was as frail as a dried leaf in the blacksmith's grip. They dragged him back to his cell and barred the door, his shrieks about the glorious hunger echoing down the stone corridor. Just before dusk, as a sickly yellow light filtered through the high chapel windows, Elia appeared at Athanasius' side. The young novice was eerily calm, the frantic terror gone from his eyes. "The voice is quiet now," he said, his own voice barely a whisper. "It has made its choice. It is waiting."
"Who, Elia?"
Athanasius asked gently. The boy looked across the chapel at Morcant, who was testing the newly installed bars on the door. "It needs a strong vessel for the final transformation," Elia said, his gaze unwavering. "One who has known violence. One who has a beast of his own already roaring to be set free. It will be him. It chose him because he desires strength above all else. Strength to protect us. It made perfect logical sense. Morkant, the guilt-ridden warrior fighting his own nature, was the ideal candidate. But as Athanasius looked at the blacksmith, then back at the strangely serene novice, a sliver of doubt pricked at him. It felt too neat, too clean, a performance for his benefit. He retreated to the small alcove that served as the chapel's library, the 9th century chronicle clutched in his hand. He reread the founder's words, searching for a detail he might have missed. And he found it. A single, terrifying line. The hunger from the moon does not claim the strongest vessel, nor the most sinful. It seeks the most empty vessel, the one that thirsts to be filled. Not the one who wants power to control his inner beast, but the one who has lost everything, even his own will. The one whose faith has crumbled to dust, leaving a hollow space inside. As evening fell, a blizzard descended upon the mountain, a howling vortex of wind and snow that sealed the abbey from the outside world. It was time. With Morkant and Günther's help, Athanasius herded every last monk into the chapel, the sane, the mad, the terrified, and the catatonic. They were all there, their faces pale and slick with sweat in the flickering light of 100 doctored candles. The air was thick with fear. Every man eyed his brother as a potential monster. Morkant slammed the great oak door shut. The heavy iron bars dropped into place with 3 deafening final thuds. They were sealed in. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, there was only the sound of ragged breathing and the thumping of terrified hearts. Through the tall, stained glass window high above the altar, the clouds parted for a moment, revealing the full moon. Its cold, white light sliced through the darkness, illuminating a perfect circle on the stone floor. And the waiting began. The beam of moonlight struck the chapel floor like a celestial hammer. The instant it did, a collective groan of agony filled the sacred space. Every monk who had spent time near the manuscript, every soul touched by its dissonant psalm, collapsed to their knees. They clutched their heads, their bodies writhing as if being torn apart by an invisible force. Athanasius gritted his teeth, the low-level hum that had been plaguing him escalating into a piercing shriek inside his own skull. His theory was correct. The resonance was now at its peak, turning the entire congregation into a chorus of suffering. All eyes, including Athanasius's, snapped to Morkant. The blacksmith was on one knee, his massive body shuddering violently. The muscles in his arms and back bunched and writhed beneath his coarse woolen robe, stretching the fabric taut. A low, guttural growl escaped his lips, a sound of pure animalistic rage as he fought against the change. This was it, the moment of transformation. Athanasius raised the silver silence, the silver-tipped bolt aimed squarely at the giant's chest. But then, amidst the chorus of groans and Morkant's agonized roars, came another sound. A quiet, wet sigh of release. It came from the corner where they had placed Abbot Alcuin, whom Athanasius had insisted on bringing from his cell. The transformation, when it began, was not a violent explosion of muscle and fury. It was a horrifying deconstruction. The abbot's frail, desiccated body began to buckle and fold. There was a series of sickeningly loud cracks, the sound of old, dry bones snapping. His spine arched backward at an impossible angle, his limbs elongating and twisting. His skin, thin and papery, split open down his back, not with a gush of red blood, but with a surge of glistening black tissue that pulsed and steamed in the cold air. He was not growing into a beast. He was hatching. In that instant, Athanasius understood everything. The final, terrible piece of the puzzle fell into place. the most empty vessel. Alcuin's faith had not just wavered, it had died, leaving a vacuum of scholarly pride and a desperate hunger for forbidden knowledge. The manuscript had not needed to corrupt him. It had simply moved in. Elia had been a psychic amplifier, his sensitivity broadcasting the psalm's signal. Morkant had been the perfect misdirection, his very real internal conflict a bright, noisy distraction from the silent, patient horror growing in the abbot's soul. What rose from the pile of torn robes was an abomination, a blasphemy of biology. It was not a wolf, not a demon. It was a chaotic mass of twitching limbs, glistening black flesh and bone spikes that punched through its skin from within. It moved on too many joints, its head a lolling, broken thing that swiveled 360 degrees. Its face was gone, replaced by a circular maw filled with shards of bone that spun like a grinder. It was the physical embodiment of mindless, insatiable hunger. The creature, the thing that had been Alcuin, unleashed a high-pitched scraping scream that vibrated in the stone and shattered the air. The sound was a weapon in itself. Half the candles in the chapel instantly extinguished, plunging the room into a terrifying chiaroscuro of light and shadow. It did not move toward Athanasius or the armed Morkant. With a scuttling, insect-like speed that defied its bulk, it lunged for the nearest cowering monk, a man paralyzed by terror. There was a wet crunch and a brief, choked scream as the creature's clawed appendages tore the man apart, pulling him into its grinding maw with horrifying efficiency. Panic erupted. The monk screamed and scrambled away, a wave of terror washing over them. "Hold the line!" Athanasius bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. He swung the sensor of retribution on its long chain, building momentum before releasing the latch. A thick, billowing cloud of acrid smoke, the burning mixture of salt, silver, and wolfsbane, erupted from it, filling the space around the altar. The creature shrieked as the smoke washed over it. Its black, glistening hide bubbled and hissed as if touched by acid. The pain drove it into a frenzy, but it also bought them precious seconds. Morkant, shaking himself free from the psychic assault and the shock of the revelation, let out a roar of pure fury. He ripped a 200-pound iron candelabra from its moorings and hefted it like a club.
"Bishop!"
he yelled, his voice raw.
"Where do I hit it?"
Günther, who had been standing frozen near the door, found his courage. With a guttural cry for his lost son, he raised the woodsman's axe he had carried with him. He was just a hunter, out of his depth in a battle against a nightmare, but he stood his ground beside Athanasius. The slaughter in the locked chapel had begun. The chapel devolved into a maelstrom of shadow and screams. The creature was a living nightmare, moving with a logic that defied physics. It scurried up the stone pillars and across the vaulted ceiling, its multi-jointed limbs finding purchase where none should exist. Its movements were spasmodic and unpredictable, a flurry of feints and lightning-fast strikes. Athanasius knew a direct assault was suicide.
"Distract it!"
he yelled to Morkant and Günther over the hellish din. "Keep it moving, don't let it focus!" Morkant charged, swinging the heavy iron candelabra in a brutal arc. The makeshift mace connected with one of the creature's limbs with a sickening crack of bone. The creature barely seemed to notice, lashing out with another appendage that left 4 deep gashes in the blacksmith's shoulder. Blood welled, dark against his brown robe. But Morkant roared and swung again, forcing the abomination back. Athanasius raised the silver silence. He fired, the crossbow bucking in his hands. The silver-tipped bolt struck the creature in its shifting torso, It pierced the black flesh, but there was no spurt of blood, only a thick, tar-like ooze. The monster shrieked, a sound of pure agony, and the wound began to close around the bolt, the flesh sizzling as it corroded the silver. The bolts caused it immense pain, disrupting its unnatural form, but they weren't lethal. Not yet. Günther, using the agility of a lifelong hunter, darted in and out, his axe a blur. He was not trying to kill it, but to cripple it, aiming for its joints. He saw an opening as the creature focused on Morkant. Elia, the young novice, had been knocked to the floor, and the monster was turning toward him, its maw spinning in anticipation. With a desperate cry, Günther threw himself between them. He swung his axe with all his might, sinking the blade deep into one of the creature's primary legs. The monster howled, more in annoyance than pain, and swatted the old hunter aside. Günther was thrown through the air like a rag doll, his body slamming into the stone wall with a final sickening crunch. He slid to the floor, motionless. The old hunter had died to buy a few more seconds of life for a boy he didn't know, but his sacrifice was not in vain. As the creature reared back, momentarily disoriented by the axe still embedded in its limb, Athanasius saw it. The full moon's light, still pouring through the high window, seemed to cause the creature distress. It didn't burn it, but where the light touched its hide, its form seemed to lose cohesion, shimmering and becoming translucent. And in the center of its chaotic mass, in the mangled ruin of what was once Alcuin's chest, something pulsed with a faint, internal light. It was a knot of bone and gristle, and embedded within it, like a dark heart, was one of the black stone plates from the manuscript. Alcuin must have swallowed it or somehow embedded it in his own flesh during his final descent into madness. That was the source, the antenna, the creature's heart.
"Morkant! The altar! Push it back to the altar!" Athanasius yelled, already moving. The blacksmith understood instantly. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he shoved the massive stone altar, grinding it across the floor and pinning the creature against the back wall, trapping it directly in the beam of moonlight. Athanasius didn't hesitate. He ran along the altar rail, smashing the clay vials of martyrs' tears onto the flagstones. The golden oil spread and ignited not with heat, but with a wave of brilliant, cold, white fire. A spiritual barrier erupted, penning the monster in, cutting off its escape. Trapped between Morkant's brute force and the wall of holy flame, the creature focused all its rage on the one who had orchestrated its doom. Its entire form seemed to contract, and its central maw widened into a vortex of spinning bone and psychic hatred. Athanasius knew he had one shot. He calmly ejected the spent cartridge from the crossbow and loaded his final bolt, one he had personally anointed with a full vial of the martyr's tears before the battle. He raised the weapon, ignoring the screaming chaos, and said a silent prayer not to God, but to the memory of every martyr whose faith gave his weapon's power. He aimed for the faint glow within the creature's chest. He squeezed the trigger. The bolt flew true. It struck the glowing plate dead center. For a moment there was no sound. Then a deafening crack, like the world's largest stone being split in two, echoed through the chapel. The stone plate exploded from the inside out, unleashing a blinding flash of pure white light that consumed all shadows. The creature froze, every limb locked in place. Its shriek was cut short. Then, its body began to disintegrate. Not into blood and viscera, but into a cascade of fine black dust and gray ash, its stolen matter returning to the nothingness from which it came. In the sudden, ringing silence,
There was only the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors, and the soft hiss of the white flame from the martyr's tears, burning itself out on the cold stone floor. The first rays of a cold gray dawn pierced the shattered stained glass window, illuminating a scene from a charnel house. The grand chapel of St. Gaul was a ruin, its sacred stones splattered with blood and littered with the dead. Of the nearly 50 souls who had been sealed inside, fewer than 10 remained alive. Morcan sat on the floor, leaning against a pillar, his shoulder crudely bandaged with a strip of his own robe. Elia was huddled in a corner, rocking back and forth, his eyes vacant as he whispered a string of nonsense words. Athanasius, bruised, cut, and utterly exhausted, surveyed the cost of their victory. Where the monster had died, there was only a large, greasy pile of black ash and the twisted, melted remains of his silver bolts. Nothing of Abbot Alcuin was left. Athanasius knelt, touching the ash. It was cold and inert. This confirmed his fear. It had not been a possession, an affliction that could be cleansed by exorcism. The man had been completely unmade, his body and soul used as fuel to open a gate, to become a temporary vessel for something that had no business in God's creation. He walked over to Morcant. The blacksmith was staring at his own hands, which were covered in blood, both his and the creature's. "During the fight," Morcant said, his voice a low rumble, "I felt it. The old rage, the beast. It was tearing at its chains." He looked up, his eyes meeting Athanasius's. But this time, it wasn't just blind fury. It wanted to protect, to defend. He flexed his blood-caked fingers. "You showed me that the beast can be a shield, not just a sword." A strange, grim peace seemed to settle over him. Elia's fate was less certain. The boy's mind, stretched to the breaking point by the psychic onslaught, had snapped. The direct connection to the alien consciousness had scoured him clean, leaving behind an empty, shell-shocked husk. He was no longer a threat, but the bright, pious novice was gone forever. Another casualty of Alcuin's pride. The most critical task remained. Athanasius gathered the remaining 11 stone plates from the scriptorium. He knew he could not simply smash them. That might only scatter their cursed influence like seeds on the wind. He needed to sever their connection to whatever they communed with. Using the complex rituals known only to the Sanctus Vindex, he brought the plates to Morcan's forge. It was a rite of unmaking. He anointed each plate with the last of the martyr's tears, chanting the litanies of sealing, not destruction. Then Morcant, using his longest tongs, placed them one by one into the white-hot heart of the forge. The stones did not burn or melt, but under the intense heat and the power of the ritual, the writhing symbols on their surfaces began to glow, then flicker, and finally fade into nothingness, leaving behind only blank, sterile slabs of black rock. Their song was over. Athanasius assembled the survivors in the ruined courtyard. Their eyes were hollow, their faith shattered. He gave them their orders, his voice leaving no room for argument. The scriptorium and the chapel were to be sealed. Their entrances would be walled up with stone and mortar, their existence erased from the abbey's records. "The official report to the diocese and to Rome will be this," he said, his gaze hard. "A sudden, violent outbreak of heretical madness, possibly caused by tainted grain. It consumed the abbot and many brothers. It has been suppressed at great cost. The truth, the impossible, cosmic truth of a hungry God from the void, would die here, buried under stone and lies. It was a truth the world was not ready for." As he prepared to leave, packing his now depleted arsenal, Morcant approached him. The blacksmith had decided to stay. The abbey needed a guardian, and he needed a new penance. "We will rebuild," he said, his voice firm. "And I will watch." He held out the steel talons he had forged, the ones Athanasius had mistaken for a clue. "Perhaps these will serve you better than they served my fear." Athanasius took the heavy, sharp implements. They felt cold and deadly in his hand. He nodded to the blacksmith, a silent understanding passing between them. He had come to hunt a beast, but had found a protector. Athanasius rode alone down the treacherous mountain pass. Günther's horse, now riderless, trotted faithfully behind his own. The alpine vistas, which had seemed so majestic on his journey up, now felt menacing. The snow-capped peaks were no longer symbols of God's grandeur. They were teeth in a cold, indifferent maw. He saw the vast emptiness between the stars not as heaven, but as a hunting ground for ancient, nameless things. He had looked into the abyss, and its chilling vacuum had imprinted itself upon his soul. His body ached with a dozen cuts and deep bruises, but that was a familiar pain. The deeper wound was in his spirit. For the first time in his service to the Vindex, he felt a tremor of doubt. Not in God's existence, but in his dominion. His faith had always been a fortress. Now he knew there were things in the universe so vast and so alien that the walls of that fortress were as paper against a hurricane. The sacred texts spoke of demons and fallen angels, but they were silent on the subject of cosmic parasites that sang worlds to death. He stopped in the small village at the foot of the mountain, the same one where he had been met with hostile whispers. The change was palpable. The villagers emerged from their homes, their faces no longer filled with suspicion, but with a raw, fearful awe. They stared at the lone, grim-faced rider emerging from the cursed mountain. Rumors, wild and distorted, had already trickled down from the abbey with a supply party that had been turned away at the gates. They spoke of a holy warrior, a battle in the night, and the banishment of a devil that had plagued the mountain for generations. Athanasius did not correct them. He let them have their simple, comforting legend. Sometimes a lie was the kindest armor against a truth that would drive men mad. That night, in a small, drafty room above the village tavern, he took out the soul mirror. He needed to see if the battle had left a mark. He held the cool obsidian disc and gazed at his reflection. The tired face of a soldier stared back. The faint shadow of his old worldly sin was gone, burned away in the crucible of the chapel. But in its place was something new, something far worse. Deep in the reflection of his eyes, like distant nebulae, were two microscopic, barely perceptible sparks of cold, pale light. The resonance, an echo of the thing he had fought, a single note of its song, now embedded in his soul. He snatched the mirror away, his hand shaking, and wrapped it in cloth, a profound horror washing over him. He was contaminated. He spent the next hour composing his report for the Sanctus Vindex. He was meticulous, describing the nature of the stone manuscript, the creature's shape-shifting abilities, its physical properties, and its ultimate weakness, the link to the stone plate. He detailed the arsenal's effectiveness, noting the agonizing but non-lethal effect of silver and the potent impact of the censer. But he deliberately omitted the most dangerous detail. He wrote nothing of the psychic resonance, of how the curse had spread like a virus of the mind. He could not. If the Order knew how easily the taint could be transmitted, their brutal calculus would demand only one solution: to quarantine the entire valley and put it to the sword and torch, consuming the guilty and the innocent alike in cleansing fire. He would not allow another village to be erased because he had told the whole truth. He knew then that his mission was not over. The Abbey of St. Gaul was not an isolated incident. If one such psalm existed, there had to be others. It was a single verse in a hymn of cosmic horror. His war had just begun. He left the village at dawn. As he navigated a high, windswept pass, a figure emerged from the swirling snow ahead. A lone traveler, cloaked and hooded against the biting wind. The man raised a hand, his voice muffled by his scarf. "A light, friend. My tinder is soaked." Athanasius reined in his horse, his senses on high alert. He dismounted and struck a flint. As the traveler leaned in, he pushed back his hood to shield the flame from the wind. For a moment the man's face was illuminated, and on the back of his hand, Athanasius saw it. A tattoo of a jagged, interlocking spiral. The man got his pipe lit. He took a puff and smiled, his eyes glinting with an unnatural intelligence. "The great hunger offers its gratitude," he said, his voice casual, conversational. "You have shown us a new path. Prove that even the strongest fortress of the flesh can be unlocked." He took another puff of his pipe. "This vessel is weak. There are better ones to be found." Before Athanasius could even reach for the silver silence strapped to his saddle, the man stepped back. The wind gusted, a wall of white snow obscuring him for a single second. When it cleared, he was gone. There were no footprints. Nothing. Only the faint, sweet smell of his pipe smoke and the chilling echo of his words. Rome's golden light and bustling crowd seemed like a fragile, painted stage set upon Athanasius's return. The city felt brittle, its inhabitants blissfully unaware of the true predators that stalked the cosmic darkness. In the hallowed halls of the Vatican, he delivered his carefully edited report to the Magister of the Sanctus Vindex, a man whose face seemed carved from ancient marble. He felt the weight of his omissions, the lies tasting like ash in his mouth. He was praised for his courage, for containing a dangerous heretical outbreak. He accepted the praise with a grim, silent nod. He did not rest. He descended once more into the Order's deepest archives, but this time he was not looking for lore on demons or fallen angels. He searched for different keywords: singing stones, cosmic hunger, moon sickness, music of the spheres. He pulled texts that had not been touched in centuries, scrolls from Alexandria, codices from the far corners of the earth. And slowly, he began to find them. He found scattered, disconnected reports that, when laid side by side, formed a terrifying mosaic. A Vindex report from the 3rd century described a Gnostic cult in the Egyptian desert that worshipped a star eater and used resonant chambers to drive its acolytes mad. A Norse saga, dismissed as pagan fantasy, spoke of Viking raiders who brought back wailing rocks from a strange land that caused their entire village to turn on itself in a cannibalistic frenzy. A silk-bound scroll detailed a Chinese emperor's quest for immortality, which involved astrologers who claimed to hear a song from the worm star and who built a tower designed to amplify its vibrations. Athanasius saw the global pattern. The thing in the Alps was not a singular monster. It was a local manifestation of a universal constant, a cosmic entity he now thought of as the Great Hunger, a force of entropy given predatory consciousness. The different cultures had given it different names: the Star Eater, the Moon Caller, the Worm, but its nature was the same. The stone psalms, the resonant chambers, the celestial towers, they were all just different kinds of tuning forks, instruments designed to allow this entity to pierce the veil of reality and find a purchase in the world of flesh. The memory of the man on the mountain pass haunted him. "You have shown us a new path," he finally understood. There were those who did not stumble upon these artifacts by chance. There was a network, a cult, that actively sought them out. They were not worshippers in the traditional sense. They did not bow before the great hunger. They were something far more terrifying. They were aspirants. They wanted to become its vessels, to achieve a kind of horrific transcendence by becoming one with the void. They were the ones who had harvested that village in the Pyrenees. They were the ones who had sent the traveler to greet him. They were testing the order, learning its methods. That night, Athanasius stood before the simple stone altar in the Vindex's private chapel. His old oath, sworn to fight the legions of hell and the heresies of man, felt hopelessly quaint. His enemy was not a fallen angel seeking to corrupt creation. His enemy was a feature of creation itself, a fundamental law of hunger that could be weaponized. He placed his hand on the cold stone of the altar and swore a new oath, a silent one spoken only to himself and whatever god was still listening. He would not just fight the monsters, he would hunt the shepherds. He would find this cult and tear it out by the root, destroying every last one of their cursed psalms. He returned to his cell. The room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a soldier's barracks. He methodically cleaned the silver silence, its mechanism clicking with deadly precision. He began the long process of brewing a new batch of martyrs' tears, the alchemical ritual a grim comfort. He took out the steel talons Morcant had given him and began sharpening them on a whetstone. His arsenal, once the pride of the order, now felt like a child's collection of toys against the scale of this new war. But it was all he had. As midnight approached, he stepped out onto the small stone balcony adjoining his cell. The city of Rome sprawled below, a glittering carpet of lights under a sky full of stars. He looked up at the moon. It was no longer a symbol of serene beauty. It was a fragile shell, a thin, luminous barrier. He knew that behind it, in the absolute cold and the infinite dark, something was waiting. Something was listening. The great hunger. And now, because of the faint echo of its song in his own soul, it knew that he was looking back. The hunt was not over. It had just escalated beyond the confines of mountains and abbeys. Beyond the world he thought he knew. He was no longer just an inquisitor. He was a solitary watchman on the crumbling border of reality, and he was ready.